Story 1. This happened when I was a kid, living in a house surrounded by woods with just a few neighbors nearby. Our place was pretty isolated, which made it even creepier at night. I remember lying in bed, unable to sleep, and feeling this unsettling vibe, like someone or something was watching me. It always happened around midnight. I'd be lying there, staring at the ceiling, when I'd hear footsteps coming from the attic above my room. They weren't loud, but they were clear enough to make me freeze. It sounded like someone was up there, just walking around. One night, I decided to check if anyone else was awake. I got up and stepped into the hallway, only to find everyone in my family sound asleep. Their doors were closed, and the house was silent except for those footsteps in the attic. So, I went back to my room, shut the door, and climbed back into bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then I heard something fall inside my closet. My heart started racing, and I was too scared to check it out on my own. Instead, I ran straight to my parents' bedroom and woke them up. At first, they were confused, groggy from sleep, but I quickly explained what I'd heard. They brushed it off, saying it was probably just my imagination, but I insisted they come back to my room with me. When we got there, everything seemed normal until they opened the closet door. Inside, a board game had fallen off the shelf and spilled all over the floor. The weird thing was, that game was tucked way at the back of the top shelf, so it couldn't have just fallen on its own. Someone, or something, had to have pushed it. My parents helped me clean up the mess and reassured me there was nothing to be afraid of. They put the game back on the shelf and then tucked me back into bed. They went back to their room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few minutes later, just as I was starting to calm down, I heard a whisper. It was faint, but I was sure someone was calling my name. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move across the wall, right by my closet. It looked like a person, and I was sure it was a ghost. I panicked, grabbed my pillow and blanket, and bolted to my parents' room, where I slept on their floor for the rest of the night. For a few more nights, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my own room. I stayed on my parents' floor, too scared to go back. Eventually, though, I returned to my bed. But even then, the footsteps in the attic didn't stop. Every once in a while, I'd hear them again, always around midnight. This went on until we finally moved away. To this day, I still have no idea what was making those noises or who or what was in that attic. But it still freaks me out whenever I think about it. Story 2. Since I started reading all kinds of true scary stories here, I figured I'd share something that happened to me, something that's still unexplained and creepy to this day. I should mention that, like some others on my mom's side of the family, I've always been more receptive to paranormal things. This specific episode took place when I was a little over 12 years old. Back then, my brother and I shared a double bed because we were 5 people crammed into a tiny apartment. My brother, who's 3 years older than me, had never experienced anything strange before that night, and even now, he's pretty skeptical about paranormal stuff. Anyway, it started as a regular night. We went to bed like always, and I fell asleep before him since he usually stayed up a bit, messing around on his phone, texting friends, and all that. Nothing seemed unusual until that night. At some point, both my brother and I woke up at the exact same time, scared and sweaty, and we were both staring at the same spot. It's hard to explain, but next to our bed, with its back against the wall, we saw a shadowy figure standing there, staring at us with red eyes. We both froze, just staring back at this thing for what felt like hours, even though it was probably just a few seconds. Then, all of a sudden, the figure vanished. I remember shaking, completely freaked out by what I'd just seen. My brother looked at me and asked, "Did you see that too?" We were both really shaken up and had no idea what we'd just witnessed. I recently met up with my brother, and out of nowhere, he brought up that night while we were talking about something completely different. He was laughing about it, but we still can't explain why we both woke up at the same time, looked in the same direction, and saw the same terrifying thing. When I tell people about this, they usually say it could have been a vivid dream, which I guess makes sense. But here's the thing, I can't figure out how my brother and I could have had the exact same dream at the exact same time, seeing the same creepy figure. I was pretty much awake. and so was he. Have you ever experienced something like this? Or do you have an explanation for what happened? Story 3. This just happened about 5 hours ago. So, a group of friends and I decided to head over to see Breeze and Jay to catch the peak of the Perseid meteor shower. We were all set up on the beach, watching the meteors, and I was hanging back in one spot, fishing while the others wandered up and down the shore. At first, everything was normal. I was focused on my fishing, so I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. But when my friends walked a bit farther away from me, they started hearing something strange, a whistling sound. They said it was short, like a referee's whistle, but more subtle, not as high-pitched. And the weirdest part? The whistles seemed to be coming from all around them, even from the direction of the bay. They told me it started with just 1 or 2 whistles, but then more and more joined in, like they were coming from every direction, almost as if the sounds were chasing them. They all freaked out, ran back to the car, and insisted I pack up my fishing gear so we could leave. I tried to calm them down, saying it was probably just a bunch of scared birds making noise, but they weren't having it. They were adamant that it didn't sound like any bird they'd ever heard. They described the noise as referee whistles, coming from every direction, and they were sure there were no birds in sight. Even with their flashlights, they didn't see anything in the water or the sky. It was dark, but still, they said they saw nothing that could have made those sounds. I kept trying to find a rational explanation. I suggested maybe it was a group of oyster catchers, but they were convinced it wasn't, and they insisted there were no birds around the bay. Then I thought maybe the sound was just echoing off the water or something. But when I asked them what they thought it could be, one of them joked about it being a skinwalker. I couldn't help but roll my eyes. Skinwalkers in New Jersey? Seriously? Now, I'm not saying I don't believe my friends, but there's got to be a logical explanation for what they heard, right? I'm just stumped. They're sure they weren't imagining things, but none of us have any idea what it could have been. So, does anyone have any ideas? Story 4. I decided to share this after seeing similar stories from others here. Back in 2020, I got married to a girl who had mentioned that her family had experienced some spooky or paranormal encounters before. It wasn't something we talked about much, but it was always in the back of my mind. While we were dating, there was this spot we loved to visit and overlook in our city where you could see the city lights below and watch the moon rise over the Rocky Mountains. It was beautiful, and we'd often go there to just talk and listen to music. One night, we were sitting in my car, enjoying the view, when my girlfriend suddenly got really quiet. She turned to me and asked, "Do you hear that?" I did, but at first, I thought the sound was coming from her. It was this heavy, breathing sound, almost like someone was right there with us. What was even weirder was that the sound didn't go away when we turned the music up. In fact, it got clearer when we turned the music off. It was loud enough that I figured it had to be coming from the car. I rolled down the windows, but that didn't make a difference. The sound was still there, and it was definitely coming from inside the car. I started to open the door, but my girlfriend grabbed my arm and screamed, "No, don't. Please, don't go out there." I froze, not sure what to do, and she just started crying. We left right after that, and I dropped her off at her parents' house about 15 minutes later. She texted me later, saying she could still hear the breathing inside the house. A week or so later, she told me that her family had experienced similar things before, but it all stopped after they asked a pastor to bless their house. It was weird, and I didn't know what to make of it, but life went on. A year later, we got married. On our wedding night, she told me about a dream she'd had 2 years before. In the dream, she saw a large figure pointing to a man who looked like me from behind. She was climbing the stairs in a house when she saw me, but before she could see my face, she woke up. Our marriage was rough from the start. It felt like everything we tried to do just went wrong. COVID hit, and we both lost our jobs. We both had bouts of depression, our health declined, and even small things started to become major issues. We eventually moved back to her hometown to be closer to family. During this time, I was diagnosed with depression, and so was my wife. It didn't make sense to me. I was relatively happy with my life and loved my wife. Things were tough, sure, but not enough to cause this kind of depression. We got a dog, and that helped for a while, But then my wife's anxiety and depression got worse. She became a shell of herself, withdrawing from me more and more. That's when I found out that 2 of her family members had schizophrenia, and her sister struggled with bipolar disorder. I was worried, but my wife promised to see a therapist. She specifically wanted one who specialized in trauma and schizoid-type symptoms. One night, we were visiting my family across town, staying in the bedroom I grew up in. We were lying in bed, just talking, when we heard the breathing again. We both froze, and that's when we heard it, a voice, clear as day, saying Hichiwai. It was a moderately deep, breathy voice, and it came from the ceiling. We both sat up, looking in the same direction, but saw nothing. We were so freaked out that we got out of bed and went to the living room where my mom was still watching TV. She could tell something was wrong and asked us what had happened. I told her we'd heard someone say hey from the ceiling. When I mimicked the voice, my mom's eyes widened. She looked at my wife, who nodded in agreement. My mom tried to brush it off, saying it was probably the TV, but that didn't make sense. The TV was too low, and the sound had clearly come from above us, not from the door. The next day, we took family photos, and during the shoot, my wife suddenly started crying outside one of the older historic houses. I pulled her close and tried to comfort her, thinking it was just anxiety, but then she told me that she'd had a dream about this house. In that dream, she saw herself dying in this very place. It was the same house she'd seen in her dream on our wedding night. After we moved back to her hometown, our marriage quickly fell apart. My wife ended up divorcing me, and I later found out she had been cheating. The divorce was tough, but as soon as she left, my depression and most of my anxiety disappeared too.